So a little update on my friend who retired, who I've spoken to before, and I want to sort of extract from his story maybe some I don't know whether they're warnings or anyway, just something to think about. As you know, or if you've seen that video, you'll know he was looking forward to his retirement. He was counting it down for years. And he, been working 35 years in IT, and he was really looking forward to just chilling out, meditating, contemplating, a little bit of local hiking, that kind of thing. Really just sort of getting down to coming to terms with, the oblivion that was coming. And I can't think of a better way to kind of gently get into that realm than stop getting busy, stop trying to, fill your life with meaningless sort of projects, and stopping working and just sort of, being with yourself. Sound like a good idea. Well, anyway, he failed completely to do that. He went sort of crazy for about 7 months, didn't know what to do with himself, and then he started a sort of online trinket business and many other things. And he's now kind of admitted that he can't stop working. He can't stop getting up at 5 a.m. and sort of, doing something that is kind of work, that he considers work. He couldn't stop. I mean, it's interesting because if retirement is the only reward for sort of 30 years of sacrifice and hard work, and then when you get to it, you realise that it was a myth, it was an illusion, then that's a real worrying thing in a way, isn't it? And it reminds me a little bit of how we were told, weren't we, that the onset of computers back in the sort of late 60s, early 70s was going to mean that we had a life of leisure. And then we were given other promises about that with automations and now with AI. This idea that we can become people of leisure. And the evidence seems to suggest that we don't understand leisure. We don't know what leisure is. Yeah, we're okay doing leisure for a short periods, but ultimately, and I think particularly as men, we actually find it very difficult to not be involved in some sort of constructive, meaningful activity. And even though it's something we kind of desire. So there's a weird paradox there. The promised land of retirement, therefore, may not be what we expect. So I don't know why men can't hack retirement. Maybe some people can. I think I mentioned before that I think if you're kind of obsessed with some sort of sport like golf, I mentioned that it might be that you can retire and then just spend your whole life, if you've got the money, spend your whole life going around a golf course. And I suppose that would be, an exception. I think most men who are not kind of 24/7 golfers will feel frustrated, and their self-esteem may even decline because they don't feel that they have any purpose in this world, and then they invent things to do. You know that scenario, I'm sure. So I think that the thing about retirement is it's always about money. So once I've got enough money, once I've got a pension, then I will stop. But I'm thinking more about the sort of psychological side of stopping. And I mentioned before, I think that there's this absolutely terrifying fear of stillness. And this has been talked about the Blaise Pascal example is the classic one, which is that a man cannot sit still in a room. All the world's problems come from the fact that a man can't sit quietly on his own in a room. We have to be busying ourselves doing something. It's like a compulsion. I don't know whether it's an illness or not, but you know how it is. It's endless. I used to know people, they would wake up in the morning and the first thing they'd say is, what's the plan? What's the plan? And they have to structure that day and absolutely fill it full. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. I'm just saying that if you spent 20 years looking forward to a quiet retirement where you can actually just meditate, contemplate, relax, indulge, and find out a lot about yourself, and just be with yourself until oblivion comes. Endless, eternal oblivion. I mean, surely there should be a few years on Earth. You're busy being a child, you're busy being an adolescent, you're busy building up your career, you're busy with family, perhaps. And then you've got this one little opportunity at the end to sort of be quietly with yourself, but they can't do it. And so that's why I'm interested in it. Silence is a kind of unbearable void, which is absolutely terrifying for a lot of people. I know somebody who has a television on in every single room in the house, and as they go from one room to another, the TV is there. And if that TV was to be turned off in any of those rooms, and they would be on their own with themselves, as Blaise Pascal said was impossible, they would very quickly feel very uncomfortable. And why are they feeling uncomfortable? Well, they're feeling uncomfortable because they are, in that moment of silence, confronted with themselves, just for that second, confronted with their past, confronted with their story, confronted with thoughts that they don't necessarily want to deal with. Well, that's fine. I mean, you just tip off the edge of the cliff without ever knowing yourself or coming to terms with things. That's what I think retirement should really be about, but it's not easy. We'll talk about why or what one can do to prepare for that. I mean, the first thing is just to know that retirement is not as easy, or stopping working is not as easy as you think. I mean, we were always, I think, fundamentally restless to some extent, or certainly, in my lifetime, there's been a certain restlessness amongst people. And it's increased, and of course it's been propagated by social media, by the internet, by the sort of 3-minute read, by the sort of quick fire news, 24 news. Everything is constantly in motion, and we get dragged into that, and we are constantly in motion as well. Very hard to get out of. I was recently asked to sit in silence for 5 minutes, where it was actually timed, and it was much harder than I thought. I actually started feeling very peculiar. In fact, after about a minute or 2 minutes, I couldn't actually, I felt I couldn't do it. I couldn't be silent in that room for 5 minutes. Well, it wasn't a room, we were outside, but it was an experiment, and I did manage it, but bloody hell, it was hard. And it reminds me of that film with Anthony Hopkins called Magic. Do you remember when Burgess Meredith, who was his manager, was suspicious that he was in a manic state? Anthony Hopkins, the puppeteer, was in a manic state and he couldn't control himself. And Hopkins said, I'm perfectly fine. He said, okay, if you're perfectly fine, he said, I'd like you to prove it to me. Don't say anything and I can't remember whether it was 1 minute or 5 minutes or 2 minutes. I can't remember, but it was a very short period of time. And so Anthony Hopkins, he said, well, it's easy, no problem. And he sat there like this. And after about 10 seconds, you could see that he was struggling. And after about 25 seconds, he was actually sweating. And he was beginning to look increasingly uncomfortable. And and then he said, how long is there left? And the guy said, 30 seconds. I think it was a minute, 30 seconds. He held on for another 5 seconds. And then he just looks at him and he said, this is very cruel. To sit and not say anything, to sit in silence, to not be distracted for 1 minute. And he said after 40 seconds, this is very cruel. So, this is the phenomenon we're dealing with. So imagine you come out of work and then you enter this so-called promised land that you've been looking forward to, that you've been promised, and you don't find it as easy as you thought. And the retirement's getting a lot shorter for people. A lot of people either can't afford to retire, or of course the retirement ages in many countries has risen over the years as well. I don't know. So, just some ideas about what it might be about. I mean, I think there's some connection, isn't there, between being a man and being a productive person in some way. Perhaps that's something to do with it, and also the concept of laziness, I guess, which is, it's an antithesis of the Protestant work ethic, which equates working hard with being a really good person. So that might be something to do with it, and maybe that's wrapped up in it to some extent. And also because I think at the heart of it, there's no practice in not working. We don't really practice doing nothing enough. That's maybe one of the issues. So if somebody is not productive and they're sort of drifting about, which is something they thought they wanted to do, but they find they can't do it, maybe they ask themselves, well, what is the point of me? All of this, of course, is ridiculous in a way. I understand it, but it doesn't really make any sense. These are people who are going to be dead forever very shortly. This is an opportunity, perhaps this is their last opportunity to indulge themselves, their interests, their passions, their ideas, to sit with themselves, learn a bit about themselves, and maybe also to get involved in kind of maybe voluntary programs in the community. I don't know, that they can do what the hell they want. But if you're unhappy, if you're bored, if you're frustrated, and if you start inventing silly new businesses, like I'm going to set up an online, I'm going to kind of do up cars, because not because you love that, but because you feel completely useless, then the promise of retirement has been a letdown, I think, to some extent. I mean, it doesn't matter what job you've done, it's probably given you some form of meaning as you've been through it. And I don't think people prepare very well for their retirement. I think that they kind of just drop into it because of their slight ignorance about what it's all about and how difficult it is to do absolutely nothing. If it removes your justification for existence, then it's not something really you should look forward to. I mean, this guy I'm talking about, he's sort of fell apart really quite quickly, and then started inventing objectively sort of nonsensical projects that were just silly. And this was somebody who, had really articulated well how he wanted to change his life, and after retirement, and indulge in very, very simple passions, but he just couldn't do it. I think it's a failure to some extent, but that's just me. There's absolutely no harm in it. I suppose another classic example is the man with the shed, isn't it? So every morning he gets up and he goes to his shed and he makes his cup of tea, and in that shed, what does he do? I don't know. He's like whittling, which means like, kind of making shapes out of wood, or maybe he's lathing spoons, that kind of thing. He's got to occupy himself in some way. Now that's fine, I guess. Well, everything's fine to some extent. You do what you do to get through life. But I'm just encouraging people to use that time, I think, a little bit to find out a little bit more about themselves, perhaps, because basically you've been making spoons for the last 40 years. Now, you might have not been literally making spoons, but you've been literally selling insurance, you've been literally driving buses, you've been literally, working as a web designer, whatever. It's the same sort of thing, isn't it? I mean, none of these things are going to carry you into eternity. They're just things we do to stay economically fit. So, this is what worries me about it. Of course, Bertrand Russell, the English philosopher, he said he wrote a book called In Praise of Idleness, and I think perhaps in that book he was, looking at this idea of finding it difficult to sit with yourself in silence, and just, he was trying to encourage it, saying it's okay to do nothing, basically. So I would say that retirement is a test, actually. It's a test of your discipline. It's a test of your steely determination to live a slightly different type of life. And I think it's a discipline. I think it's very hard. And, I think it's better to reflect a little bit, before you start getting very fidgety and going back basically to where you were before in some form or another. I think that, we waste enough life on these pointless preoccupations. And I think this is an opportunity to try and overcome that kind of issue. I think that in silence with ourselves, particularly kind of towards the end of our lives, I mean, it's like facing a terror. It's absolutely terrifying, and I understand why people distract themselves from it, and who can blame them. I'm just pointing out that there is possibly I'm not going to say better, but a different way of approaching it than just having to have endless plans, building a new kind of ridiculous schedule, sort of busying yourself, becoming a busy bee, because really all of it is just a distraction, and you're probably distracting yourself from your own mortality. All right, well, there you go. Some warnings about retirement. Prepare for it. Prepare for the fact that it might not be as easy as you think. And, start practicing doing nothing.